Welcome to Mysteries Abound, Episode 1. Our first story today is entitled The Lines of Peru, and it's about the Nazca lines, and it comes from the www.unmuseum.org website. In the Peruvian desert, about 200 miles south of Lima, there lies a plain between the Inca and Nazca valleys. Across this plain, in an area measuring 37 miles long and 1 mile wide, is an assortment of perfectly straight lines, many running parallel, others intersecting, forming a grand geometric form. In and around the lines there are also trapezoidal zones, strange symbols and pictures of birds and beasts, all etched on a giant scale that can only be appreciated from the sky. The figures come in two types, biomorphs and geoliths. The biomorphs are some 70 animal and plant figures that include a spider, hummingbird, monkey and a 1,000-foot-long pelican. The biomorphs are grouped together in one area on the plain. Some archaeologists believe they were constructed around 200 BC, about 500 years before the geoglyphs. There are about 900 geoglyphs on the plain. Geoglyphs are geometric forms that include straight lines, triangles, spirals, circles and trapezoids. They are enormous in size. The longest straight line goes 9 miles across the plain. The forms are so difficult to see from the ground that they were not discovered until the 1930s, when aircraft surveying for water spotted them. The plain, crisscrossed by these giant lines with many forming rectangles, has a striking resemblance to a modern airport. The Swiss writer Erich von Däniken even suggested they had been built for the convenience of ancient visitors from space to land their ships. As tempting as it might be to subscribe to this theory, the desert floor at Nazca is soft earth and loose stone, not tarmac, and would not support the weight of landing wheels of either an aircraft or a flying saucer. So why are the lines there? The American explorer Paul Kosuk, who made his first visit to Nazca in the 1940s, suggested that the lines were astronomically significant and that the plain acted as a giant observatory. He called them the largest astronomy book in the world. Gerald Hawkins, an American astronomer, tested this theory in 1968 by feeding the position of a sample of lines into a computer and having a program calculate how many lines coincided with an important astronomical event. Hawkins showed the number of lines that were astronomically significant were only about the same number that would be the result of pure chance. This makes it seem unlikely that Nazca is an observatory. Perhaps the best theory for the lines and symbols belongs to Toni Morrison, the English explorer. By researching the old folkways of the people of the Andes Mountains, Morrison discovered a tradition of wayside shrines linked by straight pathways. The faithful would move from shrine to shrine, praying and meditating. Often the shrine was as simple as a small pile of stones. Morrison suggests that the lines at Nazca were similar in purpose and on a vast scale. The symbols may have served as special enclosures for religious ceremonies. How are they built? Straight lines can be easily made for great distances with simple tools. 2 wooden stakes placed as a straight line would be used to guide the placement of a third stake along the line. One person would sight along the first 2 stakes and instructs a second person in the placement of the new stake. This can be repeated as many times as needed to make an almost perfectly straight line, miles in length. The symbols were probably made by drawing the desired figure at some reasonable size, then using a grid system to divide it up. The symbol could then be drawn at full scale by recreating the grid on the ground and working on each individual square one at a time. Recently, two researchers, David Johnson and Steve Mabee, have advanced a theory that the geoglyphs may be related to water. The Nazca Plain is one of the driest places on Earth, getting less than 1 inch of rain a year. Johnson, while looking for sources of water in the region, noticed that ancient aqueducts, called pukyos, seem to be connected with some of the lines. Johnson thinks that the shapes may be a giant map of the underground water sources traced on the land. Mabee is working to gather evidence that might confirm this theory. Other scientists are more sceptical, but admit that in a region where finding water was vital to survival, there might well be some connection between the ceremonial purpose of the lines and water. Johann Reinhard, a cultural anthropologist with the National Geographic Society, found that villagers in Bolivia walk along a straight pathway to shrines while praying and dancing for rain. Something similar may have been done at the ancient Nazca lines. The lines at Nazca aren't the only landscape figure Peru boasts. About 850 miles south of the plain is the largest human figure in the world, laid out upon the side of Solitary Mountain. The giant of Atacama stands 393 feet high and is surrounded by lines similar to those at Nazca. Along the Pacific coast in the foothills of the Andes Mountains is etched a figure resembling a giant candelabrum. Further south, Sierra Pintada, which means the painted mountain in Spanish, is covered with vast pictures including spirals, circles, warriors and a condor. Archaeologists speculate that these figures, clearly visible from the ground, served as guideposts for Inca traders. Welcome everyone to the Mysteries Abound podcast. This is your host Paul, and yes, we finally got there. Episode 100. The first story that you listened to came from episode 1, as you've gathered by now, which was produced on the 29th of June 2008. And looking back at my records, I see that I had a total of 2 listeners, and one of those was probably me downloading the podcast. In the last 2 weeks, the podcast has totalled 22,663 downloads. So you can see there's been a little bit of a change in download numbers in the past few years. So this episode is going to be entitled Tales from the Past and the Present. And what I'm going to do is a mixture of the old and the new. Some of my favourite stories from the past mixed in with some new ones. So our first story from the present comes from the bbc.com website, and it's about one of my favourite topics, and if you think back over the years, you'll notice that I often do stories about World War II, and especially the Third Reich. I just find some of their stuff quite fascinating. This one's entitled The Leonardo Hidden from Hitler in Case It Gave Him Magic Powers, and it's by Danny Mitzman. There is a myth in Turin that the gaze of Leonardo da Vinci in this self-portrait is so intense that those who observe it are imbued with great strength. Some say it was this magical power, not the cultural and economic value of the drawing, that led it to being secretly removed from Turin and taken to Rome during World War II. Heaven forbid it should ever fall into Hitler's hands and give him more power. Whatever the reason, this was the only work of the entire collection of precious drawings and manuscripts to be removed from the Royal Library in Turin at the time. The library's current director, Giovanni Saccani, says nobody even knows exactly where it was hidden. To prevent the Nazis from taking it, an intelligence operation saw it transported in absolute anonymity to Rome. Under such difficult circumstances, preservation was not properly considered. Nor did they have the same knowledge and techniques back then, says Sakani. Naturally, this did not do its condition any good. Inside the Royal Library, a pristine red carpet lines the stairs. We follow the steps down to a secure underground vault with reinforced doors. This purpose-built caveau has been the home of Leonardo's self-portrait and thousands of other priceless drawings and manuscripts since 1998. The picture's treatment today could not contrast more strikingly with the neglect it suffered during the first half of the 20th century. The lighting is exclusively fibre optic. No natural light can enter this room, and the temperature is kept at a constant 20 degrees Celsius, the humidity at 55%. The display cases are made of a type of glass which Sakani describes as anti-everything, and the whole area is fitted with alarms and security cameras. Under a special preservation torch, Sakani shines some light onto the drawing's surface to demonstrate the extent of the damage known as foxing, when small reddish-brown spots or marks appear on ancient paper. This case is particularly bad, he sighs. 200 years ago the foxing was less obvious. On the bottom left of the drawing there was a red chalk inscription in Latin which said Leonardus Vincius, which has now completely disappeared. Since the damage is so expensive and the paper so fragile, restoration would be extremely complex. Exhaustive analysis and discussion by world experts in restoration has led to the decision to maintain the status quo, says Sakani. And since coming to the caveau in 1998, the condition of the drawing has not deteriorated any further. This comforts us because we know we are getting it right now. You have to remember, it's a good 500 years old. The pictures we drew at school probably don't exist anymore, and this was a drawing done on ordinary paper. So I think it's pretty extraordinary that we can still display such a masterpiece today. Equally extraordinary is the story of how this self-portrait ended up in Turin. It was part of a vast collection purchased in 1839 by King Carlo Alberto of Savoy. A passionate collector, he bought it from Giovanni Volpato, an art dealer and curator who had travelled extensively throughout Europe. How he came upon Leonardo's drawings is a mystery, but it is known that he asked the king for the sum of 70,000 Piedmontese lira for the collection. The doctor earned 1,000 lira a year at the time, so it was an astronomical figure, smiles Sakani. The king managed to get him down to 50,000, but it still took him 8 years to pay for it in instalments. But Sakani says Volpato was not the ruthless businessman he might sound. Volpato's aim wasn't simply financial, because in exchange for agreeing to give the king a discount, he asked to be allowed to become the unpaid curator of drawings in the Royal Library. And since then Turin has remained the home of the red chalk self-portrait. Generally dated around 1515, some experts believe the picture corresponds more with Leonardo's style in the 1490s. Yet the subject of the drawing is an old man. He wasn't terribly keen on the idea of self-portraiture, full stop, says James Hall, author of the Self-Portrait, A Cultural History. He doesn't believe the portrait was drawn by Leonardo. He didn't much like the idea that the artwork should be a portrayal of the artist. He wanted the artwork to represent an ideal. Hall thinks this drawing has become famous at least partly because of the sheer lack of self-portraits by Leonardo. People have latched onto this like the philosopher's stone and clung to it. But others are less sceptical. I'm quite happy to believe it is a self-portrait, but I think it's for each person to decide when they see the real object, says Liz Riddell, the author of 2 books on self-portraits and a lecturer at the National Portrait Gallery in London and Slade School of Fine Art. She says most people want to believe it is a genuine Leonardo because he has this Superman status. I think we are in awe of genius, and therefore, if this is the self-portrait of a genius, then we want to see what he looked like. As director of the Royal Library, Giovanni Saccani is in no doubt. It is a self-portrait. Anyone who finds themselves standing in front of this drawing is struck dumb. The first thing they say when they recover is, "This is giving me the shivers." The expressive power of this face is absolutely connected to an emotion and an ability that only Leonardo could possess. Leonardo's self-portrait is considered so valuable that it is subject to a state decree of immovability. It can only be moved with ministerial permission. In 2011 it was taken to the Regio de Venera Real outside Turin for an exhibition marking the 150th anniversary of the unification of Italy. Transportation involved a special climber box, able to maintain the same air conditioning systems present here in the Caveau, says Saccani. This climber box was then put inside a case, which was in turn placed in an outer casing, all of which was able to avoid vibration. The package was then driven with an armed escort and constantly monitored using remote technology. An extraordinarily complex, delicate and expensive undertaking, unlikely to be repeated very often in the future. Over the coming weeks, 50 people will be allowed into the Royal Library's Caveau every hour from 9 o'clock till 6 p.m. to see the self-portrait. The temperature of the vault has been lowered slightly to compensate for the body heat that people will give off. Although there are more than 80 masterpieces on display in the King's Treasures exhibition, involving further works by Leonardo, Raphael, Rembrandt, Perugino and Van Dyck, for most visitors the highlight will be the rare chance to behold the face of the great Renaissance polymath. And they might also bear one final myth in mind. It is said that just before taking an exam, students would do their last-minute revision in the Royal Library above the vault. Legend has it that studying near Leonardo's genius can somehow rub off. And if you visit the show notes at www.origins.info and click on the link to episode 100 of the Mysteries Abound podcast, there are some photographs of the drawing under question and some other photographs as well relevant to the story. Probably worth a look. The Mysteries Abound podcast was actually my third podcast. Origins and Bizarre Bazaar came earlier. I decided to create a mysteries-style podcast after being inspired by Ben from the Mysterious Universe podcast, a fellow Australian who lives in Sydney. But my stories were going to be a little bit different. They're going to be mysteries from everywhere, not just the paranormal, but real mysteries and ancient mysteries. So I've kept true to that form, and the mysteries come from everywhere. The next story comes from episode 19, which was on the 16th of December 2008, and it's one of those old English mysteries. I quite like those, the old English mysteries of the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries. It's called The Mystery of the Green Children of Woolpit. And following on from the story of the Green Children from the previous article, there's this one from the www.mysteriouspeople.com website, and it's entitled The Mystery of the Green Children of Woolpit, and it's by Brian Horton. At harvest time during the chaotic reign of King Stephen of England, 1135 to 1154, there was a strange occurrence in the Suffolk village of Woolpit, near Bury St Edmunds. While the reapers were working in the fields, two young children emerged from the deep ditches excavated to trap wolves, known as wolf pits, hence the name of the village. The children, a boy and a girl, had skin tinged with a green hue and wore clothes of a strange colour made from unfamiliar materials. They wandered around bewildered for a few minutes before being discovered by the reapers and taken to the village. Here the locals gathered round and questioned them, but no one was able to understand the language the children spoke, so they were taken to the house of local landowner Sir Richard de Colne, a few miles away at Wykes. Here they broke into tears and for some days refused to eat the bread and other food that was brought to them. But when newly shelled beans with their stalks still attached were brought in, the starving children immediately made signs that they were desperate to eat. However, when the children took the beans, they opened the stalks rather than the pods, and finding nothing inside, began weeping again. After they had been shown how to obtain the beans, the children survived on this food for many months until they acquired a taste for bread. As time passed, the boy, who appeared to be the younger of the two, became depressed, sickened and died, but the girl adjusted to her new life and was baptized. Her skin gradually lost its original green colour and she became a healthy young woman. She learned the English language and afterwards married a man of the nearby town of Lavenham, becoming rather loose and wanton in her conduct. After a few years she was left a widow. Some sources claim that she took the name Agnes Barr, and the man she married was a senior ambassador of Henry II. It is also said that the current Earl Ferrers is descended from her through intermarriage. When questioned about her past, the girl was only to relate vague details about where the children had come from and how they arrived at Woolpit. She stated that her and the boy were brother and sister and had come from the land of St. Martin, where it was perpetual twilight, and all the inhabitants were green in colour like they had been. She was not sure exactly where her homeland was located, but another luminous land could be seen across a considerable river separating it from theirs. She remembered one day that they were looking after their father's herds in the fields and had followed them into a cavern where they heard the sound of bells. Entranced, they wandered through the darkness for a long time until they were at the mouth of the cave, where they were immediately blinded by the glaring sunlight. They lay down in a daze for a long time before the noise of the reapers terrified them, and they rose and tried to escape, but were unable to locate the entrance of the cavern before being caught. Originating in the 12th century, the strange fairy tale-like story of the Green Children remained in the popular imagination throughout subsequent history, as testified by references to it in Robert Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy, written in 1621, and a description based on the original sources in Thomas Keightley's The Fairy Mythology, 1828. There was even a supposed second sighting of green children in a place called Banjos in Spain in August 1887. However, the details of this event are almost exactly the same as in the Woolpit case, and the story seems to originate with John Macklin in his book Strange Destinies, 1965. There is nowhere called Banjos in Spain, and the account is merely a retelling of the 12th century English story. An ancient manuscript unearthed at the British Library, and dating back nearly 1,500 years, says that Jesus married Mary Magdalene and had 2 children, with their names and descendants reportedly given in detail in the text. The Church of England has dismissed the claims, saying it is closer to the fictional Da Vinci Code than historical accounts. From the ancientorigins.net website, a story by April Holloway. Transcription of ancient manuscripts suggests Jesus married Mary Magdalene and had 2 children. The so-called Lost Gospel, which has been translated from Aramaic by Professor of Religious Studies Barry Wilson and historical writer Simca Jacovici, allegedly reveals the startling new allegations, according to the Sunday Times. Professor Wilson said on his website that he found the ancient Syriac manuscript lurking in the British Museum, dating from the 6th century but translated from much earlier Greek writing. He added that scholars have known about it for almost 200 years but have not known what to make of it. According to Wilson and Jacobici, the manuscript includes details about Jesus' political connections to the Roman Emperor Tiberius and one of his generals, Sejanus, and says that there was an assassination attempt on Jesus 13 years before his execution. However, the most controversial claim is that Jesus married Mary Magdalene and raised 2 children with her during his time in Nazareth. Wilson and Jacobici are not the first to claim that Jesus had a romantic relationship with Mary Magdalene. Theologians and researchers have been speculating on the subject for centuries, but it became most popular following the release of the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which put forward the hypothesis that Jesus married Mary, had 1 or more children, and that those children or the descendants emigrated to what is now southern France. Once there, they intermarried with the noble families that would eventually become the Merovingian dynasty. This theory was further pursued by Dan Brown in his best-selling historical thriller, The Da Vinci Code, who wrote that the figure at the right hand of Jesus in Leonardo da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper is not the Apostle John, but actually Mary Magdalene. The claim that Jesus was married was once again thrown into the spotlight in 2012 when an Egyptian papyrus fragment was translated into English and was found to contain an explicit reference to Jesus being married. The so-called Gospel of Jesus' Wife dates from the 8th century and includes the line, "Jesus said to them, 'My wife,' and 'she will be able to be my disciple.'" It is a bit hard to know what to make of the lost gospel claims until further information and hopefully images of the relevant text are released for verification. But a look at the publisher's website does draw into question the authenticity of the claim, as it describes Wilson and Jacobici's book as part historical detective story, part modern adventure. Nevertheless, the preview of the book does look intriguing, and it will be interesting to see the response of the academic world. The Church of England has dismissed the claims made in the Lost Gospel, saying it is closer to popular fiction than an accurate historical account. This appears to share more with Dan Brown than Matthew, Mark, Luke or John, a church spokesman told the Sunday Times. The Mysteries Abound podcast was always a second-class citizen to the Origins podcast for quite a long time, with a lot less downloads. So what tended to happen was I tended to do more Origins podcasts and occasionally do a Mysteries Abound when I could fit it all in around my work at the Botanic Gardens. But recently the number of downloads for the Mysteries Abound podcast has far surpassed that of the Origins podcast, so now it's the other way around. I tend to do 2 or 3 episodes of Mysteries Abound and then later on an Origins. The Mysteries Abound podcast always featured stories about reincarnation when I could find a good one. And this one from episode 30 from the 14th of October 2009 is one that always interested me, when children seem to have past memories. This one's entitled, Is James Leoninga a Reincarnation of a Second World War Fighter Pilot? And following along the reincarnation theme, from the www.telegraph.co.uk website, is James Leoninga a reincarnation of a Second World War fighter pilot? James Leoninga, an 11-year-old American boy, could be the reincarnation of a Second World War fighter pilot according to a new book. He is said to have lived before as Lieutenant James Houston Jr., who was shot down by the Japanese in 1945. A book about him, Sole Survivor, is a bestseller in the US and tells how he began to have dreams about the war as a 2-year-old. His parents, Bruce, 59, and Andrea, 47, were initially sceptical about the idea of reincarnation, but have now traced the relatives of the dead pilot who were impressed by James's apparent memories of the war. Mrs. Leoninga told the Mirror, "In the throes of his nightmares, you couldn't work out what he was saying. But 2 or 3 months in, I was walking down the hall and I heard him saying, 'Airplane crash, plane on fire, little man can't get out.' It chilled me to my bone hearing this. I asked him what had happened to his plane and he said, 'It crashed on fire.' I asked how it crashed and he said the Japanese shot his plane. James said his boat was called the Natoma and he remembered the name Jack Larson." Flicking through a book, the 2-year-old pointed at a picture of Iwo Jima in the Pacific and said that was where his plane was shot down. Mr. Leoninga found that just one pilot died during the Battle of Iwo Jima, James M. Houston Jr., 21. He was shot down on March the 3rd, 1945, while on his 50th mission, his last before he was due to go home. James, now 11, from Lafayette, Louisiana, told the Mirror, "I think the story is incredible. I don't remember any of it, but hearing about what happened when I was 2, it is incredible." Vampires have been flavour of the month for the last couple of years. You have movies like the Twilight series, the TV shows like The Walking Dead and The Strain, and of course the Mysteries Abound podcast has never been adverse to a good, I repeat, good vampire story, like this one from the coolinterestingstuff.com website. The Strange Cropland Grange Vampire Mystery. And this one even has an old photograph with the caption, "Are these vampires?" The Cropland Grange vampire story took place after the English Civil War in the 1650s. The story goes such as this. A family with the surname Fisher decided to move to southern England and rented a remote farmstead. There were 2 brothers and a sister named Cranswell. The summers were quite hot. They decided to sleep with the windows open. During this time period, the building structure was only 1 story high, and near the hallway stood a chapel. Nearby was a small graveyard which once belonged to the Howard family, who were the landowners. Late in the evening, the 2 men sat with their sister Cranswell looking up at the moon. They later decided to retire for the evening, going to bed. The sister was lying in her bed scantily clad from the hot heat in the air. She then closed the window to her room, but decided not to fasten the shutters. Afterwards, she glanced out of her window, propping up her pillows as the summer day dissipated. The night engulfed itself onto the evening. However, in Cumbria at midsummer, it does not get as dark between sunset and sunrise, from being so far north. Sister Cranswell noticed several lights coming from the house, which separated the lawn from the small graveyard. After struggling to see, she made out what was to be a dark shadow moving towards the house, coming closer to her window. After being completely petrified, she couldn't get closer to the window, and it appeared to her a long bony hand which stretched in, turning the window catch. Whatever strange thing this was, it rushed towards her through the window, afterwards biting her neck and forcing her onto the ground. She then screamed in terror. Both of her brothers heard the scream and then battered down the door. They looked upon a creature which then fled back through the window, leaving their sister lying on the floor and bleeding from her neck. One of the brothers chased after this strange creature, but it was quite fast, and before he could catch up to it, it disappeared into the shadow. This undead fiend nearly killed their sister. Was it one of the first known reports of a blood-sucking vampire, also known as Nosferatu? By about episode 48 of the podcast, I'd pretty well worked out how to get the production quality that I was looking for and have that sort of mysterious, sexy sound to my voice. Well then, maybe not. Anyway, episode 48 from the 23rd of the 10th, 2011, one of my favourite topics, the Kraken. And this is called the Lair of the Ancient Kraken, possibly discovered. A giant sea monster, the likes of the mythological Kraken, may have swum Earth's ancient oceans, snagging what was thought to be the sea's top predators, school bus-sized ichthyosaurs with fearsome teeth. From the www.foxnews.com, an article by Jenna Briner. The lair of the ancient Kraken sea monster has possibly been discovered. The Kraken, which would have nearly been 100 feet long, or twice the size of a colossal squid, likely drowned or broke the necks of the ichthyosaurs before dragging the corpses to its lair, akin to an octopus's midden, according to study researcher Mark McMenamin, a paleontologist at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. There is no direct evidence for the beast, though McMenamin suggests that because it was soft-bodied and didn't stand the test of time, even so, to make a firm case for its existence, one would want to find more direct evidence. Evidence for the Kraken and its gruesome attacks comes from markings on the bones of the remains of 9 45-foot ichthyosaurs of the species Shonosaurus popularis, which lived during the Triassic, a period that lasted from 248 to 206 million years ago. The beasts were the Triassic versions of today's predatory giant squid-eating sperm whales. Mark McMenamin, a paleontologist at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, was interested in solving a long-standing puzzle over the cause of death of the S. popularis individuals at the Berlin Ichthyosaur State Park in Nevada. An expert on the site, Charles Lewis Camp of UC Berkeley, suggested in the 1950s that the ichthyosaurs succumbed to an accidental stranding or a toxic plankton bloom. However, nobody has been able to prove the beasts died in shallow water, and recent work on the rocks around the fossils suggests they died in a deep water environment, McMenamin said. I was aware that any time there is controversy about depth, there is probably something interesting going on, McMenamin said. And when he and his daughter arrived at the park, they were struck by the remains' strangeness, particularly a very odd configuration of bones. The etching on the bones suggested the Shonosaurs were not all killed and buried at the same time, he said. It also looked like the bones had been purposefully rearranged, likely carried to the Kraken's lair after they had been killed. a similar behaviour has been seen in modern octopus. The markings and rearrangement of the S. popularis bones suggests an octopus-like creature, like a kraken, either drowned the ichthyosaurs or broke their necks, according to McMenamin. The arranged vertebrae also seem to resemble the pattern of sucker discs on a cephalopod's tentacle, with each vertebrae strongly resembling a sucker made by a member of the Coleoidea, which includes octopuses, squid, cuttlefish and their relatives. The researchers suggest this pattern reveals a self-portrait of the mysterious beast. Next, McMenamin wondered if an octopus-like creature could realistically have taken out the huge swimming predatory reptiles. Evidence is in their favour, it seems. Video taken by the staff at the Seattle Aquarium showed that a large octopus in one of their large tanks had been killing the sharks. We think that this cephalopod in the Triassic period was doing the same thing, McMenamin said. More supporting evidence. There were many more broken ribs seen in the Shonosaur fossils than would seem accidental, as well as evidence of twisted necks. It was either drowning them or breaking their necks, McMenamin said. So where did this kraken go? Since octopuses are mostly soft-bodied, they don't fossilise well, and scientists wouldn't expect to find their remains from so long ago. Only their beaks or mouth parts are hard, and the chances of these being preserved nearby are very low, according to the researchers. Though his case is circumstantial and likely to draw scepticism from other scientists, McMenamin said, "We're ready for this. We have a very good case." Some people who have had close brushes with death report having left the physical body to float around and observe scenes in the direct vicinity of the body and sometimes further away in the general region. In some cases, what they've seen can be verified. Near-death experiences, or NDEs, researchers then try to determine whether the person could have seen these events or objects through normal means, without having left the body. These provide some of the strongest evidence that these mystical experiences are not hallucinations. Cases in which the experiencer's accounts are verifiable are known as veridical perceptions. Some include not only scenes observed in the world of a natural perception, but also conversations or encounters with beings on another plane of existence who tell the experiencer things that turn out to be true. From the www.theepochtimes.com website, 3 out-of-body experiences with some objective verification, and this is written by Tara McIsaac. Here are a few veridical perception cases out of dozens compiled from the work of various researchers by Jan Holden, a counselling professor at North Texas University and long-time NDE researcher. While these few cases are outstanding, it's the wealth of cases studied over more than 100 years that have a great cumulative impact on the researchers of NDEs. Case number 1. A patient observes doctor's unusual habit. Al Sullivan told his story at a meeting of the Connecticut chapter of the International Association for Near-Death Studies in 1990, 2 years after his NDE. During an emergency coronary bypass surgery at Hartford Hospital in Connecticut, he had the clear sensation of leaving his body. In a report he wrote, he said he rose to an amphitheatre-like place. While seeing what appeared to be an otherworldly scene, including his brother-in-law and mother who had died, he was able to look back to this world and see his body with the chest opened up and his heart exposed. I was able to see my surgeon, who just moments ago had explained to me what he was going to do during my operation. He appeared to be somewhat perplexed. I thought he was flapping his arms as if trying to fly. It was this part of the account that startled Sullivan's cardiologist, Dr. Anthony Lasala, who had dismissed the rest of the story as a drug-induced hallucination. Dr. Hiroyoshi Takata indeed had a habit of flapping his elbows, as Sullivan described, directing his medical staff this way to avoid touching anything after he had scrubbed in. NDE researcher Dr. Bruce Grayson spoke with Dr. Lasala and Dr. Takata in 1997 to confirm the report. Dr. Takata said that this is a habit of his. Dr. Lasala confirmed that Sullivan had told him this story and that Dr. Takata's habit of flapping his arms this way is unusual. It is not something he has seen any other surgeon do. Grayson also verified that Sullivan would have witnessed this after the anaesthesia had kicked in, and he was by all appearances unconscious. Case number 2. Seeing a brother not yet known to have died. Francis Power Cobb recounted the following case in his 1882 book, The Peak in Darien, on page 297. A dying lady, exhibiting the aspect of joyful surprise, spoke of seeing, one after another, 3 of her brothers who had long been dead, and then apparently recognised last of all a 4th brother, who was believed by the bystanders to be still living in India. The coupling of his name with that of his dead brothers excited such awe and horror in the mind of one of the persons present that she rushed from the room. In due course of time, letters were received announcing the death of the brother in India, which had occurred some time before his dying sister seemed to recognise him. And number 3, plane crash victim sees what he could not have from where his body lay. A medical officer, Dr. X, was stationed in France during World War I and was flying to the aid of a wounded pilot. Not long after taking off, the doctor's plane crashed. The crash site could not be seen from the hangars, and the hangars likewise could not be seen from the crash site because they were separated by the crest of 2 slopes. The doctor's own words were recounted by Lieutenant Colonel Frederick John Marion Stratton, a professor of astrophysics at the University of Cambridge, Stratton, in a 1957 article titled An Out-of-the-Body Experience Combined with ESP, published in the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research. While I was up above my body, it did not seem in the least queer that I could see a number of activities at the hangars. The Crossley tender, an ambulance, started out of the hangar in which it was garaged. When about 1.5 car length outside the hangar, the engine stalled, and I saw the chauffeur jump out and pull the starting handle. Then he raced back to his driving seat and started off towards the crash over the crest. While this small episode was occurring, my medical orderly had rushed out of my nearby medical hut and jumped into the back of the Crossley tender. The ambulance or tender then stopped again, but this time it was the medical orderly who jumped out, rushed into the medical hut and came out with something extra and jumped into the ambulance, which then resumed its twice interrupted journey. Dr. X told all of this to his commanding officer at the hospital after recovering enough to realise the significance of what he'd seen. The officer recorded it and verified that the ambulance journey did in fact begin this way. But by the time Stratton investigated the case, the commanding officer and others who could have re-verified the information had either died or could not be traced. I've always been quite fascinated when I come across stories of alternate histories. Did the history we learn at school actually be true? Is it just the European perspective? Do other cultures have a history that's different to ours? I came across a story like this in episode 70, which is entitled "The Phoenicians Discovered America 2,000 Years Before Columbus?" The clipping is coming up next, and you'll notice that I seem to have a particularly sexy voice in episode 70. Maybe I had a cold or something like that. I think I'll practice and see if I can get it this deep again without getting a cold. I like the sound of this sexy voice. Columbus, credited with the discovery of Americas, may not have been the first to set foot on the continent, says a British explorer, claiming that the Phoenicians actually beat him by 2,000 years. From the www.phenomenica.com website, the Phoenicians discovered America 2,000 years before Columbus? Christopher Columbus, the poster boy Renaissance explorer, found fame and fortune by sailing from the Old World to the New, crossing the great unknown waters between Spain and the Caribbean in 1492. In an ambitious voyage that could challenge maritime history, former Royal Navy officer Philip Beale hopes to sail a replica Phoenician boat 10,000 kilometres across the Atlantic. Beale aims to demonstrate that the Phoenicians, a Semitic civilization that prospered between 1500 and 300 BC on the Mediterranean coast, sailed to the Americas first, CNN reported. It is one of the greatest voyages of mankind, and if anyone could have done it before Columbus, it was the Phoenicians, said Beale. Of all the ancient civilizations, they were the greatest seafarers. Lebanon had cedar trees, perfect for building strong boats. They were the first to use iron nails, and they had knowledge of astrology and currents, he said. The prospect of sailing a 50-ton wooden vessel identical to those built 2,600 years ago across the Atlantic might appear foolhardy. However, Beale has already sailed the replica boat, named the Phoenician, around Africa in 2010. In a bid to demonstrate the ancient civilization had the capability to circumnavigate the continent 2,000 years before the first recorded European, Bartholomew Diaz, in 1488. The Phoenician boat covered 32,000 kilometres over 2 years, setting sail from Syria in 2008, battling everything from 6-metre waves off the Cape of Good Hope to Somali pirates. Beale based his ambitious quest on a quote by Greek historian Herodotus, who claimed the Phoenicians circumnavigated Africa in 600 BC. Phoenicians were renowned as an intellectual and industrious civilization who helped develop the alphabet we still use today, along with their sophisticated seafaring skills. And if you care to visit the show notes, there is a video attached to this article entitled "The Quest for the Phoenicians, Part 1. Today, the little town of Eulalia, a ferry's ride across Puget Sound from Seattle, is a mostly forgotten place. The handful of dilapidated buildings are testament to the hard scrabble farmers, loggers and fishermen who once tried to make a living among the blackberry vines and Douglas firs. But in the 1910s, Eulalia was briefly on the front page of international newspapers for a murder trial, the likes of which the region has never seen before or since. From the SmithsonianMag.com website, a story by Bess Lovejoy. The doctor who starved her patients to death. At the centre of the trial was a woman with a formidable presence and a memorable name, Dr. Linda Hazard. Despite little formal training and the lack of a medical degree, she was licensed by the state of Washington as a fasting specialist. Her methods, while not entirely unique, were extremely unorthodox. Hazard believed that the root of all disease lay in food, specifically too much of it. Appetite is craving, hunger is desire, craving is never satisfied, but desire is relieved when want is supplied, she wrote in her self-published 1908 book, Fasting for the Cure of Disease. The path to true health, Hazard wrote, was to periodically let the digestive system rest through near-total fasts of days or more. During this time, patients consumed only small servings of vegetable broth, their systems flushed with daily enemas, and vigorous massages that nurses said sometimes sounded more like beatings. Despite the harsh methods, Hazard attracted her fair share of patients. One was Daisy Maud Hagland, a Norwegian immigrant who died in 1908 after fasting for 50 days under Hazard's care. Hagland left behind a 3-year-old son, Ivor, who would later go on to open the successful Seattle-based seafood restaurant chain that bears his name. But the best remembered of Hazard's patients are a pair of British sisters named Claire and Dorothea, known as Dora, Williamson, the orphaned daughters of a well-to-do English army officer. As Eulalia-based author Greg Olson explains in his book Starvation Heights, named after the locals' term for Hazard's Institute, the sisters first saw an ad for Hazard's book in a newspaper while staying at the lush Empress Hotel in Victoria, British Columbia. Though not seriously ill, the pair felt they were suffering from a variety of minor ailments. Dorothea complained of swollen glands and rheumatic pains, while Claire had been told she had a dropped uterus. The sisters were great believers in what we might today call alternative medicine, and had already given up both meat and corsets in an attempt to improve their health. Almost as soon as they learned of Hazard's Institute of Natural Therapeutics in Eulalia, they became determined to undergo what Claire called Hazard's most beautiful treatment. The Institute's countryside setting appealed to the sisters almost as much as the purported medical benefits of Hazard's regime. They dreamed of horses grazing the fields and vegetable broths made with produce fresh from nearby farms. But when the women reached Seattle in February 1911 after signing up for treatment, they were told that the sanitarium in Eulalia wasn't quite ready. Instead, Hazard set them up in an apartment on Seattle's Capitol Hill, where she began feeding them a broth made from canned tomatoes. A cup of it twice a day and no more. They were given hours-long enemas in the bathtub, which was covered with canvas supports when the girls started to faint during their treatment. By the time the Williamsons were transferred to the Hazard home in Eulalia 2 months later, they weighed about 70 pounds, according to one worried neighbour. Family members would have been worried too if any of them had known what was going on. But the sisters were used to family disapproving of their health quests and told no one where they were going. The only clue something was amiss came in a mysterious cable to their childhood nurse, Margaret Conway, who was then visiting family in Australia. It contained only a few words, but seemed so nonsensical the nurse bought a ticket on a boat to the Pacific Northwest to check up on them. Dr. Hazard's husband, Samuel Hazard, a former army lieutenant who served jail time for bigamy after marrying Linda, met Margaret in Vancouver. Aboard the bus to their hotel, Samuel delivered some startling news. Claire was dead. As Dr. Hazard later explained it, the culprit was a course of drugs administered to Claire in childhood, which had shrunk her internal organs and caused cirrhosis of the liver. To hear the Hazards tell it, Claire had been much too far gone for the beautiful treatment to save her. Margaret Conway wasn't trained as a doctor, but she knew something was amiss. Claire's body, embalmed and on display at the Butterworth mortuary near Pike Place Market, looked like it belonged to another person. The hands, facial shape and the colour of the hair all looked wrong to her. Once she was in Alaya, Margaret discovered that Dora weighed only about 50 pounds, her sitting bones protruding so sharply she couldn't sit down without pain. But she didn't want to leave Alaya despite the fact that she was clearly starving to death. The horrors revealed in Dora's bedroom were matched by the ones in Hazard's office. The doctor had been appointed the executor of Claire's considerable estate, as well as Dora's guardian for life. Dora had also signed over her power of attorney to Samuel Hazard. Meanwhile, the Hazards had helped themselves to Claire's clothes, household goods, and an estimated $6,000 worth of the sisters' diamonds, sapphires, and other jewels. Dr. Hazard even delivered a report to Margaret concerning Dora's mental state while dressed in one of Claire's robes. Margaret got nowhere trying to convince Dr. Hazard to let Dora leave. Her position as a servant hindered her. She often felt too timid to contradict those in a class above her, and Hazard was known for her terrible power over people. She seemed to hypnotise them with her booming voice and flashing dark eyes. In fact, some wondered if Hazard's interest in spiritualism, theosophy and the occult had given her strange abilities. Perhaps she hypnotised people into starving themselves to death. In the end, it took the arrival of John Herbert, one of the sisters' uncles whom Margaret had summoned from Portland, Oregon, to free Dora. After some haggling, he paid Hazard nearly $1,000 to let Dora leave the property. But it took the involvement of the British Vice-Consul in nearby Tacoma, Lucien Agassiz, as well as a murder trial to avenge Claire's death. As Herbert and Agassiz would discover once they started researching the case, Hazard was connected to the deaths of several other wealthy individuals. Many had signed large portions of their estate over to her before their deaths. One, former state legislator Louis E. Radar, even owned the property where her sanitarium was located. Its original name was Wilderness Heights. Radar died in May 1911 after being moved from a hotel near Pike Place Market to an undisclosed location when the authorities tried to question him. Another British patient, John Ivan Flux, had come to America to buy a ranch, yet died with $70 to his name. A New Zealand man named Eugene Wakelin was also reported to have shot himself whilst fasting under Hazard's care. Hazard had gotten herself appointed administrator of his estate, draining it of funds. In all, at least a dozen people are said to have starved to death under Hazard's care, although some claim the total could be significantly higher. On August 15, 1911, Kitsap County authorities arrested Linda Hazard on charges of first-degree murder for starving Claire Williamson to death. The following January, Hazard's trial opened at the county courthouse in Port Orchard. Spectators crowded the building to hear servants and nurses testify about how the sisters had cried out in pain during their treatments, suffering through enemas lasting for hours and endured baths that scalded at the touch. Then there was what the prosecution called financial starvation. Forged cheques, letters and other fraud that had emptied the Williamson estate. To make matters darker, there were rumours, never proven, that Hazard was in league with the Butterworth mortuary and had switched Claire's body with a healthier one, so no one could see just how skeletal the younger Williamson sister had been when she died. Hazard herself refused to take any responsibility for Claire's death, or the deaths of any of her other patients. She believed, as she wrote in Fasting for the Cure of Disease, that death in the fast never results from deprivation of food, but is the inevitable consequence of vitality sapped to the last degree by organic imperfection. In other words, if you died during a fast, you had something that was going to kill you soon anyway. In Hazard's mind, the trial was an attack on her position as a successful woman, and a battle between conventional medicine and more natural methods. Other names in the natural health world agreed, and several offered their support during their trial. Henry S. Tanner, a doctor who fasted publicly for 40 days in New York City in 1880, offered to testify in order to hold up the conventional medical fraternity to the derision of the world. He was never given the chance. Though extreme, Hazard's fasting practice drew on a well-established lineage. As Hazard noted in her book, Fasting for Health and Spiritual Development is an ancient idea, practiced both by yogis and Jesus Christ. The ancient Greeks thought demons could enter the mouth during eating, which helped encourage the idea of fasting for purification. Pythagoras, Moses and John the Baptist all recognized the spiritual power of the fast, while Cotton Mather thought prayer and fasting would solve the Salem witchcraft epidemic. The practice experienced a revival in the late 19th century, when a doctor named Edward Dewey wrote a book called The True Science of Living, in which he said that every disease that afflicts mankind develops from, more or less, habitual eating in excess of the supply of gastric juices. He also advocated what he called the no breakfast plan. Dewey's patient and later publisher Charles Haskell declared himself miraculously cured after a fast, and his own book, Perfect Health, How to Get It and How to Keep It, helped promote the idea of starving yourself for your own good. Even Upton Sinclair, the author of The Jungle, got into the act with his non-fiction book, The Fasting Cure, published in 1911. And the idea of fasting your way into health is still around, of course. Today there are juice cleansers, extreme calorie deprivation diets, and the breatharians who try to live on light and air alone. Back in 1911, the jury in Hazard's trial was unmoved by her claims of politically motivated persecution. After a short period of deliberation, they returned a verdict of manslaughter. Hazard was sentenced to hard labour at the penitentiary in Walla Walla and her medical licence revoked. For reasons unknown, she was later pardoned by the governor, although her licence was never reinstated. She served 2 years, fasting in prison to prove the value of her regimen, and then moved to New Zealand to be near the supporters. In 1920 she returned to Alaya to finally build the sanitarium of her dreams, calling the building a school for health. The institute burned to the ground in 1935, and 3 years later, Hazard, then in her early 70s, fell ill and undertook a fast of her own. It failed to restore her health, and she died shortly thereafter. Today, all that remains of her sanitarium are a 7-foot-tall concrete tower and the ruins of the building's foundation, both now choked with ivy. The location of her downtown Seattle offices, the Northern Bank and Trust Building on 4th and Pike, still stands. The shoppers and tourists that swarm the streets below, blissfully unaware of the schemes once plotted above. The music for today's podcast came from the musicalley.com website. The bandwidth is provided by TalkShoe at www.talkshoe.com. The show notes are kept at the Origins podcast website, www.origins.info. The Facebook page for the podcast is located at www.facebook.com/Paul Rexy, or just click on the Facebook link at the show notes. Just like to say thank you to these people for giving the podcast a donation: Michael Bacon, Stagecraft Film Services, Sean Yarnell and Sarah Richard. Thank you, everyone. Your help is greatly appreciated. Now, to bring the podcast to a close, One of those stories that have become so popular on this podcast from that great website, the www.creepypasta.com website. I'm not going to read a new one. I'm going to bring in one of the old ones, which is my favourite, or one of my favourites anyway, from episode 70, The Melancholy of Herbert Solomon. One of my favourites. But just before I let the story come in, just like to say a big thank you to everyone who has supported the podcast over the last 100 episodes. I actually considered dropping this podcast a couple of years back because it didn't get the numbers needed to sort of make it viable. But today, it's my most popular, so who knows. So thank you everyone, thank you for your support, and let's look forward to another 100 episodes. So here comes the story, The Melancholy of Herbert Solomon. The Melancholy of Herbert Solomon from the www.creepypasta.com, and this is credited to Michael Whitehouse. On several occasions, my interest in the supernatural has taken me to some of the most prestigious seats of learning in the entire United Kingdom. From the venerable halls of Oxford and Cambridge to the more humble surroundings of inner-city colleges and schools, my pursuit of evidence to substantiate such claims has rarely been fruitful. However, while exploring the University of St Andrews in Scotland, I found a rather interesting tome hidden away in a dark, musty corner of the campus library. The book itself was unusual, its cover bound in a weathered and blackened leather which unashamedly wore the wrinkles and cracks of time. It dated back to the 16th century and seemed to contain various descriptions and accounts of the daily lives of the people of Ettrick, a small isolated town built in the southern moorlands of the country. Perusing the volume, there was a variety of entries from a number of authors spanning a 60-year period. It seemed to have been handed down from town elder to town elder over that time, and to be quite frank, most of it contained idle musings on the townsfolk and plans for a number of humble building projects and improvements. Just as I was about to conclude that the book was of little interest to me, I noticed on the inside of the back cover that someone had drawn a picture. It was elegantly depicted, but I would never have described it as a pleasing sight. In fact, my immediate reaction was one of disgust upon first viewing it. The combination of the harsh, almost angry black lines used and the stark imagery of the scene as relayed by the artist left me with a thoroughly unpleasant impression of its subject. I shuddered as I cast my eye over it in an attempt to take in the picture of what seemed to be of a man, tall, with long, thin arms and legs. His face was partially obscured by one of his gaunt white hands, but what could be seen was monstrous. Prominent veins protruded from his forehead, leading up to a pallid bald head. His eyes were deep set into his skull, and the surrounding woods seemed to twist and lean away from him fearfully. At first I assumed that the picture was some form of hideous graffiti, but at the bottom of the page was inscribed the date of 1578, and a rather unusual name, Herbert Solomon. Whether this was the name of the menacing figure in the drawing or of the artist, I do not know. Disturbed yet compelled by that dark woodland scene, I decided that the book required further study. I desired greatly to know who this creature was, and why someone had felt the need to capture his strange form in a drawing. A drawing at the back of a book otherwise used to record the lives of the townsfolk. On closer inspection, what surprised me further was that the same image seemed to recur elsewhere in the book, but drawn by apparently different individuals. Within the book I found numerous mentions of Herbert Solomon, and it became clear quickly that he was indeed the emaciated man in the picture. He had lived in the 16th century on the outskirts of Ettrick Town. It was a small and underdeveloped place, surrounded on all sides by the thick cover of Ettrick Forest, which itself sat in the midst of a vast region of southern moorland. The town had a small parish church with one humble steeple, an inn normally used by those travelling through the unforgiving countryside, and quaint cobbled streets which wound their way around the stone cottages and stone hall. According to the descriptions in the book, during the December of 1577, children began to disappear from the town. The first was a young girl by the name of Alana Sutherland. She had been playing with some friends by an old well on the outskirts of the town, but had dropped a small toy doll down it accidentally, which had caused her much distress. Unable to retrieve it, she returned home to borrow some string and an old hook in the hopes of being able to fish the doll out of the water below. She was last seen walking towards the well just as the sun set. In a panic, the townfolk searched. They dredged the well, they combed the wheat fields, and even sent groups of those willing into the surrounding woods. Alas, the girl was not found. A few days later, a young boy by the name of Eric Kennedy was running an errand for his grandmother. It was dark, but he had only to take some wool over to the Munro place as a way of thanks for the grain they had provided, and they lived but only a few streets away. It was assumed that at least the centre of town would be safe. But the boy never completed his errand. He vanished, as if he were torn from existence. By the end of January, an unusually bitter wind had caused significant damage to the town and its people. Large, thick sheets of ice and snow covered each house and building. Several people died from the cold alone, and the general mood of Ettrick Town was a sombre one. Despite these trying times, the townspeople were more concerned with the safety of their offspring. In total, 7 children had now disappeared without rhyme or reason. Whole families wept in despair, and the people of Ettrick began to view one another suspiciously. They knew the truth. Someone was taking their children from them. By mid-February, 2 more had went missing, and accusatory glances were now being shared between every family and every member of the community. The town elder decided to act, and took it upon himself the arduous task of identifying and catching the fiend. Bureaucratic discussions were had, church groups convened, and in every house, in every street, in every corner of Ettrick, one name crossed the lips of its inhabitants: Herbert Solomon. The more the name was mentioned, the more certain his guilt became. Herbert Solomon was an outsider. He lived in a small wooden cabin amongst the woods which surrounded the town, and due to his unfortunate appearance tended to avoid human contact. What his malady was, no one was sure, and in the unenlightened times of 16th century Scotland, many believed that he was cursed. Modern eyes would have guessed him to be the victim of a wasting disease. He rarely ventured into town, except on a few occasions to trade for supplies, and even in those instances he covered his face with a brown tarnished hat and a grey piece of cloth, which obscured his features below 2 deep-set and darkened eyes. Several of the townsfolk told stories of Herbert Solomon. According to these accounts, he would stand on the edge of the forest watching the farmers till their land and their children play in the fields. It was his fascination with children which left many feeling uneasy. Some of the town's children returned home from playing near the woods on a number of occasions with beautifully crafted dolls and toys. They were a present from Herbert Solomon, and being innocent children, they could not know of the dangers therein. When the children began to disappear, eyes immediately turned to the strange man living in the woods. Accusations were carried by the whispers of fearful parents, and as the whispers increased in number, so did their volume, until it was decided that Herbert Solomon must be stopped. On a cold February night, the elders of the town decreed that Solomon should be arrested immediately. Grief, anger, resentment and fear grew to a fever pitch with this news, and every man, woman and child set out across the fields, entering into the surrounding forest in search of the child killer, Herbert Solomon. Details of exactly what occurred that night are limited, but it seems as though the people of Ettrick Town attempted to remove Herbert from his small cabin by setting it on fire. The crowds cheered as the heat grew and the fire rose. His screams echoed through the woods, finally to be silenced by the flames. The townsfolk believed that justice had been done, and while the grief of the parents whom had lost their children could never be quenched, there was at least the satisfaction of knowing that the man responsible was now dead. However, over the following few days, an unease descended upon the entire town. Stories began to spread of strange encounters in the streets at night, a gaunt, shadowy figure prowling the cobbled stones, hiding in the darkness. Within a week, numerous residents claimed to have woken up during the night to the petrifying sight of an unwelcome visitor. One account was of an elderly lady who woke to the sound of something rustling under her bed, only to nearly die of shock as a tall, thin man pulled himself out from underneath. She fainted, but not before she saw his face, a withered complexion as if ravaged by disease, his eyes blacker than night, and his hands comprised of tightly pulled skin over a bony interior. Another story consisted of a local tradesman who, while investigating a noise from his cellar, was confronted by a hideous figure, so tall and gaunt that it had to hunch over to avoid the low ceiling entirely, its sheet-white face flickering in the candlelight. The man managed to escape, but he refused to re-enter his premises. It became clear to the townspeople that the vengeful ghost of Herbert Solomon was still searching for other victims from beyond the grave, his hate and hideous form haunting the town which murdered him. With each passing day, the sightings grew in intensity and number. A fog descended on the town, and the people wept and grieved as the sound of Herbert Solomon terrorized each person, night by night. He was seen wandering among the wheat fields, in the cellars and lofts of cottage houses, his long gaping footsteps ringing out each night through the streets of Ettrick Town. They had been cursed. In life, Herbert Solomon had taken and murdered their children, and now in death he seemed to possess the twisted means to terrorize the entire town. Then the unthinkable happened. Another child went missing. A young orphan girl, who often wandered the streets when she could not find a place to call home for the night, was heard screaming for her life. The townsfolk rushed to their windows, looking out, but not daring to leave the imaginary safety of their houses, paralysed with fear. The screaming ceased quickly, and moments later, wandering aimlessly out of the fog, came the menacing figure of Herbert Solomon. He rushed down the street, his lifeless arms bashing against the houses which he passed, scraping the doors and windows with his rigid fingers, emitting an unnatural yell of anger and hatred on his way. The girl was gone, and the town grieved once more. In the preceding days the fogs grew denser, and when it came, the unwelcome news of 2 more children taken. One a girl whom, after having a raging argument with her family, left the house, never to be seen again. The other a boy named Matthew, the son of a notable drunk, who was taken from his own bed by the hands of Solomon while the father lay unconscious from drink. During a church service, the unthinkable happened. Solomon appeared briefly in the aisles of the church, seemingly unaffected by consecrated ground. The congregation whimpered in horror and disdain as his warped, spindly form walked slowly behind a pillar and then vanished. It was indeed a show of influence. Hope was almost lost. Not even a place of worship could deny him, and he was now capable of entering any home at night and then taking whatever or whoever he wished. The town had to act or abandon the place altogether, but there was no guarantee that the curse of Solomon would not follow. The local vicar, a man by the name of Mackenzie, was asked by the people of Ettrick to use any sacred power which was ordained to him. In an attempt to destroy or banish the spirit of Solomon, a plan was provided. The vicar and a few chosen individuals, armed with torches, swords which had been blessed, and the vials of holy water, would take guard over the town, waiting for the cursed figure of that child killer to show his face once more. Then they would confront him. Observing as much of the town as possible from several house windows, roofs and strategic street corners, Mackenzie's chosen waited. They did not, however, need to wait long. That night the lonely figure of Herbert Solomon appeared through the mist, walking the streets of Ettrick with purpose. Yells and screams rang out as people alerted one another that Solomon had returned. Families held their children close as dark thoughts consumed the town. "Please spare my child, take another's." Mackenzie was the first to confront him. His will was shaken by the sight of Solomon's hideous pallid face, rotten and ravaged. The gangly, spindling figure stood staring intently at the figure through black, clouded eyes. Another man now joined, then another, and before long Herbert Solomon was surrounded. Mackenzie instructed the men to slowly close the circle, drawing their swords with one hand while brandishing flaming torches with the other. Fear gripped them, but they knew that this could be their only chance. Mackenzie threw a vial at Solomon's lumbering feet, and as he uttered a Christian psalm, another man struck out with his torch. The blow crackled as the cloth-covered arm of Solomon caught fire. Cheers rang out from the townsfolk, watching from their homes above. But the man had strayed too close, providing a gap in the circle which Solomon claimed with purpose. He fled. His spindling legs and flailing arms cast spider-like shadows on the walls and cobble streets as he passed. The townsfolk gave chase, following the pathetic figure as it negotiated each street corner, lane and courtyard in an attempt to escape their rage. The noise alerted the town. "Herbert Solomon is trying to flee." From every home across the town, people poured out of their houses, carrying whatever they could as a makeshift weapon. They flooded the streets and ran towards the protestations, shouts and screams of Solomon's pursuers. With every turn of a cobbled street corner, Solomon was running out of places to hide. Finally, as he stumbled down the town's main street, he stopped. The townsfolk had blocked all escape routes. He was trapped. Mackenzie pushed his way to the front of the crowd, asking for quiet and calm as he approached the hunched, defeated figure of Herbert Solomon. He and his chosen few were going to rid the town of Ettrick of this abomination once and for all. Vial in hand, accompanied by several large bullish men brandishing swords, Mackenzie approached, slowly reciting verses from the Bible. Through dark eyes, Herbert Solomon observed the townfolk, their faces etched with hate and thoughts of revenge, moving towards him, and then he simply turned and entered an open doorway next to him. The people gasped, and Mackenzie and his followers rushed inside after him. The house they entered was still, and lying on the hard wooden floor of the main hallway was the pale body of a young girl. The creaking of the floorboards under weight sounded above as numerous pursuers searched the house, disappointed to find nothing. Then something miraculous occurred. The little girl gasped for air. She was alive. She had little or no strength. All she could do was utter one word: below. In the cellar of the house, Mackenzie found a grim and horrific scene. The floor was covered in blood, and the quite dead body of a man lay face down upon it. Chained to the walls of that dim place were the children who had been taken. They were partially drugged, malnourished and traumatized, but they were alive. The town rejoiced with the news. Families were reunited. Lives were mended. The mist of a bleak and horrible winter slowly lifted, and all seemed well. On regaining their strength, the children recounted what had befallen them. Each of them had been taken by a man called Tom Sutherland. He was the father of the first girl who had went missing, and it appeared that it was he whom had killed her. No one knew for sure, but many were aware of his bad temper, and on more than one occasion he had beaten poor Alana. Consumed by guilt and loss, Sutherland began taking children at knife point and locking them in his cellar, often drugging them with a local herb and occasionally beating them while pathetically weeping in self-pity. On the day that the children were found, Sutherland entered the cellar drunk, carrying a knife and rope. He began striking the children once more and told them that one would die that day. He untied one of the children and pinned her to the ground with his knees. The knife hovered over her neck, but just as he was about to plunge the blade into her, someone entered the house. Sutherland grew ferocious with anger, but whoever was standing at the top of the stairs struck such fear into him that he quickly backpedaled into the cellar. Ducking under the doorway was the tall, scarred figure of Herbert Solomon. At the sight of him, and now being free, the little girl crawled quickly between Herbert's long legs. She was free, but too weak to run. She fainted before she could escape the house. Details of what happened to Tom Sutherland were muddied by the unstable, semi-conscious condition of the witnesses, but it was clear that his neck was broken, his head twisted with such force that it faced an unnatural opposite direction. There were various accounts of subsequent glimpses of Herbert Solomon, and some of the children claimed to find beautifully crafted dolls and toys on occasion sitting at the edge of the woods, but of course this cannot be substantiated. Indeed, I would have said that the entire story could not be substantiated if it were not for the events which I experienced several months after reading that old book in the depths of St. Andrews University. A colleague and dear friend of mine invited me to stay at his family home for a few days in the countryside. I knew that the house was in the borders, not half an hour's drive from Ettrick, and could not miss the chance to have a closer look at the area. I had managed to persuade the powers that be to allow me to take the book from St. Andrews and show it to my friend. He had a particular interest and not insignificant knowledge of the history of the area. I thought perhaps he could shine a light on this curious tale. His family were very kind to me, and the house and its grounds were serene in the summer sun, with his children playing in the fields, having a carefree and happy time. After reading the book, he told me that it was fascinating, and that he knew of a local poem which had been written in the 17th century about a man called Solomon who killed children, but he could not tell me any more. The next day we heard screams coming from the nearby house. It was my friend's little girl. We raced outside, following the cries for help over an old fence and down a steep grassy hill. We reached a winding and furious river. The little girl had fallen in and was clinging to a large tree root which thrust out from the opposite embankment into the water. The root was wet, and my friend let out a scream of anguish as his daughter lost her grip, being swept downstream towards a large formation of huge, sharp rocks which jutted out from beneath the surface. The river would not let go, and was throwing her around with such force that it was difficult to see how she could survive. Filled with the abject terror that she could drown, we finally made it to the water's edge. As we rushed into the murky torrent, we watched helplessly as the poor little girl was about to crash into the rocks. We were too far away. Suddenly our attention was grabbed by the cracks and creaks of a tall, gaunt figure at the other side of the river, rushing out of the woods at tremendous speed on the opposite bank. With one swift motion, a thin, bony hand plunged into the violent water, prevailing against the immense currents, finally pulling the young girl to safety. She was alive, frightened, crying, but alive and unhurt. The pale-faced, emaciated figure placed the girl gently on the ground, stared at us from across the water through darkened eyes, as we ourselves clambered to safety, then turned and disappeared into the woods, fading away to nothing but a memory. Even in death, Herbert Solomon was the kindest and gentlest of souls.